In his 1853 poem Mycerinus, Matthew Arnold draws on a figure from Herodotus's histories, the just but short-lived Egyptian king Menkaure, to dramatize a meditation on fate, justice, and divine indifference. Writing in the high Victorian age, Arnold often grappled with the tension between classical ideals and the encroaching modern crisis of faith, and Mycerinus stands as one of his clearest poetic engagements with the problem of moral striving in a universe that offers no clear reward for virtue. Traditionally, readers have taken the poem as a tragic lament. A king who reveres law, resists the tyrannical example of his father, and aspires toward diviner things, is paradoxically punished by the gods with a sharply limited life. This reading interprets the poem's reflective tone and rhetorical questions as expressions of disillusionment with divine justice and a bitter recognition that moral conduct does not ensure cosmic favor. Yet this interpretation, while attentive to the poem's melancholy atmosphere, misses the deeper irony and philosophical rigor of Arnold's portrayal. Far from regretting the shortness of his reign, Mycerinus ultimately understands it as the very condition that makes just rule possible. In contrast to his father, whose long life enabled unchecked injustice under the illusion of permanence, Mycerinus, constrained by time, rejects delusion and chooses virtue without expectation of reward. The poem, then, is not a tragedy of divine neglect, but a critique of moral illusions and a revaluation of justice as something dignified precisely because it arises in full knowledge of mortality and cosmic silence. In this light, Mycerinus offers a profound meditation on ethical clarity in the absence of divine guarantees. I looked for life more lasting, rule more high, and when 6 years are measured, lo, I die. This abrupt juxtaposition lies at the heart of Mycerinus, not only in tone but in moral logic. The first line carries a clear expectation that virtue, obedience to law, and moral self-restraint will earn from the gods a proportionate reward, life more lasting, rule more high. But the second line breaks this expectation cleanly. The speaker does not deny that he acted justly. He does not admit failure or error, and yet his fate is sealed. Death arrives early, not as a consequence of wrongdoing, but in spite of his devotion to right. This passage serves as the foundation for the triad that governs the opening movement of the poem: mortality, illusion, and justice. What Arnold presents through Mycerinus is a deliberate reordering of their relationship. Traditionally, justice, especially when rooted in piety or lawful obedience, was assumed to attract divine favor. In this model, a just king would expect to live long, rule wisely, and be honored. But Mycerinus's reflection discredits that system. What he confronts is not only his own death, but the unraveling of a metaphysical logic that linked goodness to reward. The expected causal sequence, virtue leads to divine favor leads to extended life, is inverted. What remains when that illusion collapses is mortality. Yet the poem does not treat this as a source of despair. Instead, mortality becomes the epistemic condition that enables true ethical clarity. It is precisely because the illusion is gone, because he no longer believes that justice will be answered by divine reward, that Mycerinus can begin to understand the full weight of moral choice. His fate is fixed. The gods are either silent or bound by forces beyond themselves. No plea, no conduct will alter the 6-year limit. That recognition transforms his perspective. Justice must now be chosen not as a means to some greater end, but as an end in itself. The awareness of mortality, then, functions not as a punishment, but as a lens. It allows him to see clearly. In recognizing that death will not be deferred for virtue's sake, he can finally ask what virtue is without the scaffolding of reward. The result is not resignation, but ethical autonomy. Mycerinus affirms his conduct not because it benefits him, but because it is right. And this recognition does not emerge in spite of his approaching death. It emerges because of it. Later in the poem, Arnold underscores this transformation with a moment of reflective depth. And by that silent knowledge day by day was calmed, ennobled, comforted, sustained. What is this silent knowledge? It is not divine revelation, It is the absence of revelation. It is the settled awareness that justice will not be externally affirmed. But rather than collapsing under that knowledge, Mycerinus is steadied by it. Day by day, he is sustained not by hope, but by clarity. And that clarity arises from disillusionment. This reversionary structure, where the collapse of illusion leads to the recognition of mortality, and that recognition enables justice, forms the foundational triad of the poem. Arnold uses the voice of Mycerinus not to express bitterness at a shortened life, but to dramatize the ethical reorientation that mortality imposes. The grandeur of eternal reward is stripped away, and in its place remains the quiet dignity of a finite life chosen freely, under no illusion, and without appeal to heaven. The gods offer nothing. But Mycerinus, for that very reason, sees more clearly. He dies, not defeated, but lucid and just. 6 years, 6 little years, 6 drops of time. The recurrence of 6 in this line, with its deliberate scaling down, years, then little years, then drops of time, calls not simply for pity but for precision. What Mycerinus confronts is not merely the fact of a shortened life, but its shape. Time, when limited, becomes legible, and through that legibility emerges ethical orientation. The triadic relationship in this phase of the poem, constraint, clarity, and righteous governance, does not operate through simple succession. Rather, each element conditions the others. The constraint imposed by the 6-year sentence is not an external tragedy, but an internal structuring force. Because his time is bounded, Mycerinus is able to see more clearly what matters. Clarity is not imposed from above, it arises within the limits of the possible. And once this clarity is achieved, it does not sit passively in the mind. It demands expression, and that expression is governance. The enactment of justice in the public world. Arnold constructs this triad not as a metaphysical argument, but as an inward psychological evolution. Mycerinus does not rule well despite his constraint, but because of it. The limit on his life makes visible the stakes of power. Whereas his father, unbounded and unreflective, perpetuated injustice, Mycerinus recognizes that every decision within these 6 years must count. In that recognition, he sees himself not as an agent of divine will, but as a finite being acting with moral intent. The mutual reinforcement of this triad is made explicit in one of the most quiet yet resonant lines of the poem. And by that silent knowledge, day by day was calmed, ennobled, comforted, sustained. This is not the knowledge of religious promise nor of philosophical certainty, but of limitation, silent knowledge. There is no thunderous revelation, only the steady, accumulating awareness that time is short, and that righteousness is valuable, not because it is rewarded, but because it is worthy within time. That is the calm he finds. It is what ennobles his rule. It is what comforts him, not against death, but within life. His governance flows from this clarity, and that clarity, in turn, deepens because he governs justly under pressure. If there is nobility in Mycerinus's kingship, it is not derived from title or divine sanction, but from proportion. His ability to govern within scale. Constraint produces clarity. Clarity enables justice. Justice confirms the value of constraint. Each of these terms, in turn, depends upon and reinforces the others. So the triad does not describe a moment of transformation alone. It articulates a governing philosophy. In Mycerinus's vision, righteous rule cannot occur where time is imagined as endless, where self-deception clouds judgment, or where consequence is endlessly deferred. Justice becomes possible not in the expanse of eternity, but in the bounded space of human life, measured not in abstractions, but in drops. My father loved injustice and lived long, crowned with grey hairs he died and full of sway. The weight of these lines lies in their juxtaposition. To love injustice and to live long are not, in a moral universe, expected to coexist. The king's unjust life ought to have ended in ruin, or at least reproof. But Arnold pointedly tells us, it did not. His reign endured, His power was undiminished. He died full of sway. This is not an incidental detail. It is an indictment of the very illusion Mycerinus has already abandoned, the belief that moral order is guaranteed by divine oversight. Yet the father's failure is not reducible to personal vice. What Arnold draws attention to is a structural error, a system in which the absence of constraint produces the persistence of delusion, which in turn sustains injustice. This negative feedback triad functions in the opposite direction from the one that governs Mycerinus's rule. Where limitation leads the son to clarity, the father's unbounded time insulates him from reflection. He lives too long, and so never pauses to ask whether he rules rightly. Delusion here is not a moment of error, it is a condition. The father believes, perhaps, that his reign is justified simply because it continues. There is no friction, no external sign that would suggest he is wrong. Without mortality pressing in, there is no need to re-evaluate. And without re-evaluation, injustice becomes normalized. The structure reinforces itself. As long as he remains alive and powerful, the illusion of moral adequacy remains unchallenged. As long as the illusion holds, injustice proceeds unchecked. Arnold's phrase, crowned with grey hairs, is particularly resonant. The image evokes dignity, experience, a life well lived. But in this context, it becomes ironic. The father is not wise, but simply aged. His long life is not a mark of divine favor, but of divine silence, or perhaps divine neglect. That silence, as we saw in Mycerinus's own meditation, can produce clarity. But here, in the absence of constraint, it produces only stagnation. The negative triad, then, is not a mirror image of Mycerinus's structure, but its systemic foil. The absence of limit, not just of death, but of interruption, of challenge, allows self-deception to endure. That deception, the belief in one's own invulnerability, the illusion that power justifies itself, sustains injustice not as a choice, but as a default. The longer the reign, the more entrenched the system becomes. And the more entrenched it becomes, the less likely it is to be questioned. In contrasting these two rulers, Arnold presents not merely two personalities, but two ethical models, one finite, self-aware and just, the other limitless, self-satisfied and blind. Mycerinus is shaped by his ending. His father is unshaped by anything. This is not simply a narrative contrast. It is a moral argument. Justice does not grow in the open-ended reign. It requires resistance. It requires pressure. And above all, it requires time that can run out. Seems it so light a thing, then, austere powers, to spurn man's common lure, life's pleasant things? This line opens a series of stanzas in which Mycerinus no longer speaks merely of his own fate, nor of his father's failure, but of the gods themselves. His tone is interrogative, at once earnest and a bit accusatory. He asks not simply why he must die, but how the divine order can appear so unmoved by human striving. If it is easy for the gods to deny mortals the pleasures of life, then what do they value? If not justice, if not piety, if not temperance, then what? At this point in the poem, the triadic structure shifts. Mycerinus now considers three interlinked concepts: the possibility of divine justice, the persistence of human aspiration, and the apparent reality of cosmic indifference. Each term stands in relation to the others, but the pattern is not one of mutual reinforcement. Instead, we find a retrospective breakdown, a structure where the absence of one element, such as divine presence or responsiveness, unravels the coherence of the others. Human aspiration, on its own, is not presented as naive or ignoble. Indeed, Mycerinus describes it as something rooted in reverence, not ambition. Yet surely, O my people, did I deem man's justice from the all-just gods was given, a light that from some upper fount did beam. Here we see what he had once believed, that moral striving on earth corresponded to an archetypal order in heaven, and that justice, therefore, was not a human invention, but a participation in something higher. This is the center of the triad. Aspiration, understood as a bridge between the human and the divine, but that bridge has now collapsed. The light he once trusted has gone out. The all-just gods have not answered. And worse still, it's not even clear whether they can. In one of the poem's most disturbing hypotheses, Mycerinus wonders, "And the great powers we serve themselves may be slaves of a tyrannous necessity." This line reframes the silence of the gods not as cruelty, but as impotence. If even the gods are swept along by some greater, unalterable force, then the very idea of divine justice collapses, not just as an active principle, but as a possible one. The universe, once imagined as moral and responsive, may be governed instead by necessity, blind, indifferent, and absolute. Within this breakdown, aspiration becomes tragic. Mycerinus does not renounce his desire for justice. Rather, he sees that desire as unrecognized and unreciprocated. The gods neither bless nor rebuke. They are silent, or, more radically, absent. And yet, he does not retreat from justice. He continues to speak to his people, to rule with dignity, and eventually to turn toward joy, not because the gods deserve reverence, but because he himself has learned what matters. In this way, the retrospective triad becomes clear. The collapse of cosmic justice calls into question the validity of aspiration, and yet, aspiration itself points back to its origin and shows that its worth may not depend on cosmic recognition at all. Arnold crafts here not a theodicy, but a moral severance. If the gods do not answer, the burden of meaning falls to us, and this burden does not crush Mycerinus, it clarifies him. The silence of the gods does not destroy his moral structure, it frees it from dependence. Justice becomes not something granted from above, but something affirmed from within. What is left is not consolation, but autonomy, and what could have been despair becomes instead a kind of dignity. My crime, that wrapped in reverential awe, I sate obedient at the feet of law. This line delivers the central paradox of Mycerinus. In a just cosmos, the speaker's reverence for law, his obedience, and his moral restraint would be counted as virtue. Instead, they are presented as a crime, not by himself, but by the silent powers that have decreed his early death. There is no admission of guilt here, only irony. Mycerinus does not ask for pardon because he has done no wrong, and yet he suffers, not randomly, but precisely because he chose to act justly. This is the tragic irony that shapes the final turn of the poem, and it is through this irony that Arnold constructs a final triad: disillusionment, autonomy, and tragic insight, a harmonic structure in which each term both opposes and completes the others. Disillusionment is the starting condition. By this point in the poem, Mycerinus has fully abandoned the idea that moral action ensures cosmic favor. The gods, once imagined as all just, are now interrogated, doubted, and possibly dismissed as indifferent, or even bound by forces they themselves cannot resist. The collapse of divine reciprocity means that justice must stand on its own. But this collapse does not destroy him. Instead, it clears the ground for something greater: autonomy. His autonomy is not defiant in the modern sense, not willful rebellion, but rather a quiet, interior sovereignty. Mycerinus rules himself, and by extension, his people, from a position of clear-eyed self-mastery. The disillusionment that might have led to nihilism instead leads to freedom. The freedom to act justly without hope of reward, and to embrace joy without fear of transgression. His is not a reactive virtue, seeking validation, but a lucid one, chosen deliberately in the absence of metaphysical guarantees. And it is here that the third term of the triad emerges: tragic insight, a condition in which the tension between clarity and suffering produces not despair, but understanding. Arnold's poem offers no redemption, no reversal of fate, no assurance that virtue will be remembered or restored. And yet, within that structure, something deeply affirmative takes shape. Mycerinus becomes not simply a tragic figure, but a moral exemplar, not because he is rewarded for his virtue, but because he holds to it even when it is unacknowledged. The virtuous man suffers because he is virtuous and lucid. This is the insight Arnold draws to the surface. It is not blindness nor arrogance that brings about Mycerinus' suffering. It is his very clarity. He understands the structure of the world and chooses justice nonetheless. He sees that the gods are unmoved, that the moral architecture he hoped for may not exist, and yet he continues to act as though it does. His virtue is not conditioned by outcome. It is sustained in the full knowledge that outcome and virtue may have no connection at all. This is what makes the triad harmonic. Each term, disillusionment, autonomy, and tragic insight, presses against the others, but none can be removed without collapsing the structure. The absence of illusion gives birth to autonomy. That autonomy, in turn, becomes meaningful only when tested by the absence of reward. And the suffering that results is not a failure. It is the seal of authenticity. There is a kind of music here, though it is not triumphant. It is ethical, not emotional, structured, not sentimental. It plays quietly through the poem's final movements, where no gods intervene, but where the king, clear-eyed and unyielding, continues to speak and act with dignity. Arnold gives us no consolation, but he gives us something perhaps more durable. An image of justice stripped of illusion, guided by clarity, and affirmed by the one who chooses it, alone. The rest I give to joy, even while I speak, my sand runs short. With these words, Mycerinus moves from moral reflection to action, not rashly, not bitterly, but with full awareness of the choice he is making. There is no illusion that joy will redeem him or change his fate. His life is nearly over, the sentence of the gods will not be revoked. And so he makes his final decision, to turn not toward despair, nor to ascetic self-denial, but to joy, embraced under the sign of mortality. At first glance, this appears to be a tonal rupture, a retreat from tragedy into self-indulgence. But that reading fails to recognize the internal logic the poem has been building from the beginning. Mycerinus' embrace of pleasure is not escape, it is resistance. This movement forms a triad in which pleasure is not an end in itself, but an act of defiance made meaningful through its connection to mortality and autonomy. His pleasure is qualified from the outset. The rest I give to joy. The phrase acknowledges that his earlier reflections, his clarity, his restraint, all of it, precede and condition this final turn. It is not joy instead of moral thought, but joy after and because of it. This pleasure is not indulgent fantasy. It is measured, temporal, and chosen precisely because the gods offer no reward. In their silence, the only answer is to live meaningfully in time, and pleasure, taken honestly and with open eyes, becomes one expression of that meaning. And when the mirth waxed loudest, with dull sound sometimes from the grove's centre echoes came, to tell his wondering people of their king. The people, hearing of his feasts, are confused. Their wondering reflects the surface paradox of a virtuous king reveling. But we, having followed the arc of his inner logic, understand what they do not. This joy is not a contradiction of his moral stance, but its natural extension. He is not mocking the gods, nor trying to escape his condition. He is affirming that value and pleasure, like justice, do not need divine sanction to be legitimate. This is where mortality becomes central to the triad. The knowledge that my sand runs short lends every moment of joy its weight. In contrast to his father, who feasted under the illusion of permanence, Mycerinus feasts with a deep awareness of finality. That awareness does not poison pleasure, it dignifies it. The wine, the grove, the lamps strung from tree to tree, all shine with heightened intensity because they are framed by the certainty of their ending. Mortality does not diminish joy, it sharpens it. It may be on that joyless feast his eye dwelt with mere outward seeming. He, within, took measure of his soul and knew its strength. These lines remind us that even amid outward revelry, the inner clarity remains. The feasting is not empty, it coexists with reflection. This is not a man who has forgotten himself, It is a man who, knowing exactly who he is and where he stands, chooses joy. And that choice, made with no promise of reward and no expectation of divine justice, becomes a final act of defiance. Not rage, not rebellion, but the assertion of human value in the face of cosmic indifference. The triadic structure here is inclusive. Pleasure, undertaken in light of mortality, affirms resistance. Not in the sense of battle, but in the sense of sovereignty. Mycerinus's rule continues not through decree or law, but through self-possession. He does not ask the gods to notice him anymore. He acts as though they do not matter. In that act we see not a loss of meaning, but its full arrival. He has passed through disillusionment, clarity, justice, and now joy, all shaped by a singular principle. That meaning does not come from above. It comes from the stance one takes toward the world one knows is silent. He within took measure of his soul and knew its strength, and by that silent knowledge day by day was calmed, ennobled, comforted, sustained. These lines carry the weight of final judgment, not divine judgment, but moral culmination. The revels of chapter 6 continue in outward form, lamps strung through the trees, goblets brimming, music echoing through the grove. But here Arnold shifts our focus inward. What matters now is not the noise, but the silence that frames it. Within that stillness, Mycerinus is not uncertain. He is not haunted nor restless. He measures his soul and finds it sufficient. This is the beginning of the final triadic movement. First, silence. Not simply the absence of sound, but the absence of noise from beyond. The gods, the people, the world's acclaim. It is a metaphysical quiet. The heavens have ceased to speak, and no new vision is offered. This silence, which could threaten to collapse meaning, instead becomes the condition for reflection. What Mycerinus gains here is not new knowledge, but self-knowledge. He no longer questions the gods. He no longer looks outward for confirmation. He looks inward, and there he finds what he had been denied from above: structure, clarity, and strength. It is not a fiery strength. It does not cry out or revolt. It is still, self-knowing, and firm. The pleasure of the grove has not dulled him. It has created the space in which inner measurement can occur. What is especially significant is that this strength is not framed as resistance to the gods. That contest is over. Nor is it stoic resignation. Mycerinus is not passively accepting his fate. Rather, what emerges here is convergence, the elements of his life, his clarity, his autonomy, his joy, gather inward, condensing into a final ethical form. Silence leads to reflection. Reflection reveals strength, and that strength gives shape and coherence to all that preceded it. Arnold's language confirms this quiet consolidation. It may be, but not less his brow was smooth, and his clear laugh fled ringing through the gloom. Despite the inward meditation, the outer image is not of collapse, but composure. There is no bitterness in the laughter, no doubt in the stillness. Even winter with its sad tranquility, and spring with its cold winds, fail to erode his calm. Mycerinus's joy, having passed through reflection, becomes durable. It is not the reckless pleasure of denial, but the sustained joy of a man who has weighed himself and found his footing in the silence of the world. The final term, strength, is not brute will, but the result of coherence. Mycerinus is strong because there is no contradiction in him. Every earlier movement, his justice, his disillusionment, his pleasure, has passed through his self-awareness and been accepted. There is no lingering confusion. The world remains unresponsive, but he is no longer asking for a reply. This is why Arnold does not end the poem with a final word from the gods, nor with a dramatic death. Instead, he leaves us with a sustained mood, an interior clarity that does not need to speak. Mycerinus is finished not because his time is over, but because his structure is complete. And so the final triad closes. Silence permits reflection. Reflection reveals strength, and that strength, in turn, holds the silence not as absence, but as atmosphere. The world remains what it was, vast, unmoved. But Mycerinus is changed. He does not command the stars, but he no longer fears their indifference. He has become his own measure. The transformation that takes place in Mycerinus is not mythic, it is human. It begins with a simple premise. Your time is limited. Whether decreed by gods or biology, the outcome is the same. You will not live forever. That recognition, so basic it's easy to overlook, was the foundation of Mycerinus's clarity. He accepted, without appeal or self-pity, the sentence passed upon him. 6 years, and no more. But rather than retreat into despair or grasp for illusions, he asked the only question that matters once mortality is accepted. What is worth doing with the time I have? That question defines the arc of the poem, and it can define a life. The process Arnold lays out, subtly, structurally, and without dogma, is one of ethical condensation. The illusions fall away first, the belief that justice will be rewarded, that virtue will shield you from harm, that the world is structured to recognize your efforts. These are comforting beliefs, but they are unstable. If you live by them, you will one day be undone by them. Mycerinus shows us what happens if you let them go early, before suffering strips them away. He does not abandon justice. He reclaims it on new terms. He does not turn to pleasure out of weakness but out of strength. The strength of knowing that meaning must be built inside time, not outside it. And most importantly, he does not turn bitter. He turns inward. He rules himself, he reflects, he celebrates, he endures. And in the end, he is not broken by silence, but clarified by it. Anyone who begins from the same understanding, that life is short, that the world is silent, and that no reward is guaranteed, can follow the same path. From this position, justice becomes a choice, not a transaction. Joy becomes a presence, not an escape. Strength becomes an interior structure, not a public spectacle. You may not be a king, but you do not need to be. What Mycerinus offers is not a model for ruling others, but a model for ruling yourself when the world offers no confirmation. To live like Mycerinus is to live without illusions, and yet without cynicism. It is to affirm that silence is not the enemy of meaning, but its precondition. Arnold does not promise that the just will be rewarded, or that the gods will notice. He promises only that if you take measure of your soul in silence and live accordingly, you will know what to do, and that in the end is enough.